To the Enlightening Lunch, and it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce someone who is really central to the fabric of ASU in a number of different ways. And I think that started long before he came to ASU and long before his protege, if I may call him that, came to ASU. Barry Bozeman is a professor of public administration. He's accomplished in public policy, science studies, numerous different fields that a number of you care about for different reasons. And he is a rare person in that he's both a highly capable scholar, something you don't come across every day. He's also sort of widely revered, which doesn't go hand in hand. Just because you're a capable scholar doesn't mean that people know your work or like it or like you. And the opposite can, of course, also occur. But to complete the picture, he's incredibly down to earth, meaning he's a straight shooter, he's not afraid of common sense, he's able to discourse on any imaginable topic that I've seen thrown at him, everything from baseball statistics to 1950s jazz to pop culture. It's incredible to think what Barry knows. And only recently have I started wondering, what does Barry not know? I found out yesterday he doesn't know how to play the piano well. Barry has been the mentor and advisor to many successful academics, including several who have gone on to become university presidents, and among that crowd is, of course, our own Michael Crow, President Crow. And Barry and Dr. Crow have a book out on laboratory design, institutional design for laboratories in the US, as you may know. And Barry's opened up a number of different research areas. He's incredibly highly cited. As a matter of fact, many of his co-authors, I understand, have as their highest cited publication that paper they wrote with Barry. It's amazing how revered he is. About 2 months ago, I was at an NSF-funded workshop on technology transfer. And the way I understand it, 20 years ago, one day, Barry kind of thought, well, what's up with technology transfer? Let me do a lit review, put together a paper, put it out there. Okay, now I understand the state of the field. Well, it continues to be the paper that people turn to as sort of, introducing them to the literature on technology assessment, to the various theoretical frameworks for it. And every time that paper, or indeed the notion of scholarship on technology assessment, was referred to in the workshop, everyone sort of paused and looked at Barry and sort of had a little nod his way. And as it should be. But it's sort of curious that was just something that he, a seed that he cast to the side and it happened to bloom. He's also developed interesting research methodologies, frameworks, dispositions that sort of are core to the mission of SFIS, of CSPO, of the HSD program. Among them is the notion of public value mapping, something that I believe was born as I got the story from Barry a few years ago when he was observing that many arguments over research investment, infrastructure, public policy take place and play out in a realm where you might have concerned citizens voicing their values and concerns, and then you have others who are translating their agendas into economic quantitative terminology, and lo and behold, it's the latter group that seems to win the day. So public value mapping is, in a way, an attempt to develop a logical and compelling counter system in order to structure inquiry and, in fact, argumentation over the authorization of projects and the assessment of those projects. Of course, it's been mostly used in the academic setting as an alternative way of asking what are and what should be the outcomes of a particular research program. So Barry's got a whole book on that, and his most recent book is on the science of team science. And he's not going to talk about any of those things today. He's going to talk about organizational reflexivity from the standpoint of being a center director, which is something that Some of us are, some of us used to be, some of us will be, and among that latter crowd, some of you don't know it yet, but you will be. Hopefully I've embarrassed Barry. That was sort of one of my goals here. If not, then I'll just keep going. No, but really, please, if you are in our HSD program, please consider taking one or more courses from Barry. He's teaching a class this, I think, next fall that will be on higher learning and university policy, and that's relevant to several of you. But you can learn an incredible amount in terms of methods, method selection, research design, and research redesign once you've actually started embarking on a research project and you need to sort of rethink where you are. So he's an incredible resource for us at every stage of our career. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barry Bozeman.
Eric, that was a wonderful introduction. It was a little flowery and long. I mean, I could have summarized it much more easily by saying, wow, he's really an old dude. And that's really what it all boils down to. But it's nice to have the more expanded version. Thank you. So today I'm going to do something I rarely get a chance to do, which is I'm going to talk about something I've never talked about before. I've actually talked a lot about my work on university research centers and other kinds of centers, but I'm just basically going to use that as kind of a taking off point. So the reflexivity part is key here. So this is the participant observer part. These are a set of centers I've had something to do with. In most cases, I was the founder. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these in turn. So this is just the overview. Also, I thought it would be good to have a little bit of artwork in case attention flags. And so since I work in science centers, I thought I should give you some science photos. And I think these are very exciting ones. I don't remember the name of all of these particular operations that I visited. Actually, I think I may have the distinction of at least visiting more R&D laboratories than any other human on Earth, with the possible exception of my Chrome. But this one I've renamed the Third Combustion Lab, the Styx River Nuclear Plant. The organization of the talk goes as follows. First of all, I'm going to talk mercifully briefly about findings from research studies on interdisciplinary research centers and collaboration. You'll see soon why that's going to be mercifully brief. And then the more meandering, discursive, unpredictable part of the talk will focus on experiences in designing, directing multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary research centers and collaboration in those centers. And to the extent possible, I will try to weave in some content that links the two. And then I hope we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and even quite a few Q's. So first of all, another time out for a nice, I don't have any idea what this thing is, but it looks like a Flux capacitor to me that I photographed at Oak Ridge National Lab several years ago. Some of you are familiar with the Flux capacitor. So first of all, let's talk about part one, which is reported the lessons I've learned from research on collaboration and research centers. And so this is a partial list of the studies that I'm happy to talk about today, but also will, to some extent, give a good reason why it is that we're not going to dwell on this. Here's the work prior to 1990, and also I'm trying to strive to get the award for the worst PowerPoint presentation that anyone's ever done, because I hate PowerPoint so much that I'm thinking if I can help blow it up, and we can start all over again. But that's just kind of my Terminator side coming out. And also, please read this quickly, so you can see why I don't want to talk about this in great detail. Instead, why don't we consider this? So this part you can actually see, and this is based on the part that you could not possibly see unless you were some sort of bird of prey with attendant vision of the bird of prey. This part you can probably see. But these are the topics that I've been able to address with my colleagues over many years that related to research institutions, centers, and collaboration. And what I'm going to suggest is that Not that I review each of these topics, otherwise I'd have to come. Actually, I started to say I'd have to come back for lunch about 40 times, but now that I think about it, you know, if you want to invite me, the food here was really good. It was usually in my college we just get pizza all the time, and it's kind of greasy, but this food was good. So you can invite me back 40 times, and we'll talk about each one of these. Or alternatively, if you don't want to do that, then maybe what you should do is think about if there's any of these issues that might spur you to ask a question after I finish whatever it is that I'm going to talk about, which I'm still trying to decide. So back to the participant observer part. These are the centers that I, in most cases, had some role in both originating and directing. None of these is equivalent to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, I might add. They're a little bit smaller than that, but still, you know, you have to reflect on smallness as well. So first of all, I'd like to talk about the things I learned from my very first center, which I started in 1981. And this is very personalistic, and it has all of the advantages and disadvantages of personalistic talks. So bear with me, and if you don't like personalism, then, well, multitask. You've all got phones, so you know how to do that, just multitask. So first of all, let me say a little bit about the origins. And my center started the way that many other centers do, which is through hard negotiation. So I wanted to start, when I was in graduate school, I wanted to, my goal, I know this is really weird, but my goal was to start and direct a policy-focused research center, either in universities or somewhere else. And that's actually explains much of the trajectory that I took in graduate school, which I will not, for the sake of ennui, go over this. But at any rate, I finally got a chance to do that. I was at the Maxwell School, which is a well-known public affairs program at Syracuse University. And this is significant. The directors of the Maxwell School, most of the time, were economists. And so economists have a tendency to say, you think you're so hot, go ahead and get another job offer, and then maybe we'll give you a raise. You know, that's just kind of the way things work. But that was also nice, too. I mean, it is true we had to fly around the country a lot, and it was not very efficient, but it also worked. And so I went out and got another job offer to start a center somewhere else, and they came back and said, okay, I've got this offer in the pocket, this is a good university, where are you going to go? And so then I came to, they said, oh, well, give me a proposal. And I came back with a proposal for something called the Technology and Information Policy Program, later the Center for Technology and Information Policy, which when it started was nothing except letterhead, but letterhead is very important. So ultimately they approved this. My good friend and department head at the time, and also a derisive, skeptical human being, would laugh and put parentheses around the name of our center every time it started. I think part of it was I was a little whippersnapperish there, and particularly in Maxwell School, and that was when I was pretty young. But in fact, it began to work out pretty well. We very quickly got a very large gift from the Sloan Foundation. We had a huge contract from Niagara Mohawk. We got another one from NYSERDA. We got a couple of NSF grants. We were rocking pretty early. But I should also mention the human parts of this, and particularly Crow, Shangraw, Brett Schneider, and Walter Meyer. And all of them were abundantly instrumental in the success of this early center. And this was kind of curious. Just when I got authorization to get going with this, I went on leave. I'm not going to explain that when it takes too long, but I did. And Mike Crow happened to show up that summer before I went on leave. And Rick Shangraw, who's now the foundation president here, some of you know him, enrolled in our program that same time. And then I took off. And so when I came back, the center was, and this punchline will not surprise you, running better than when I returned. Because Mike Crow, when I met him, was not the typical youngster in a social sciences PhD program. He was about 30, I think, about that, and he had already run a research center, and was running a research center in Carbondale at Southern Illinois, and he had had a lot of experience, and I never quite got this story of how he got in that position in the first place, but he was not your typical graduate student. Rick Shangra also was not your typical graduate student because he was kind of smart all the way up to here, and he was very young. So we had a smart person with a lot of experience and a smart person who was very young, and they bonded. So when I got back from leave, everything fell in place. You know, sometimes that happens. So they had connected with a person by the name of Walter Meyer, since deceased. He had a very unfortunate end to his career at an early point, but he had an endowed chair in engineering, and when I got back, I should also point out that Mike and Rick and a couple of other people flew down to see me while I was on leave, or actually drove down to see me quite a lot when I was on leave, so this is not a big surprise to me, but we had merged with the Institute for Energy Research, which was moribund in the engineering college, and all of a sudden we had a lot of resources, some space, and lots of students, and combined all the resources that I had with all the resources that Walter had, who had an endowed chair with a lot of fancy money in it. So one of the lessons I learned from this particular experience was how to deploy excellent students who may or may not have any real background or interest, usually background, in anything related to science and technology policy. And the answer is, if they're good enough, you can find ways to align their values. I'll come back to that. The other thing I learned, and these are very practical lessons, I'm sorry if you're not sort of in the practicalities, is the value of being off-world. Many times I've had deans and other people tell me, well, I'm really sorry, but I'm not sure we have enough space for you right here. That's not the important point. The important point is co-location. And we did so well with co-location. The first thing we did was we moved into a very large, nice fraternity house right next to the tennis court. This also has to do with the informal organization, I might add, in human relations. It was possible to build up a coterie of not only active researchers, but active tennis players. And the best part was, we could come back to work and take a shower. Small things like that really help. Another off-world experience that we had was when we benefited from institutional decline. So about the time the center was really beginning to go, Syracuse University, for reasons I won't go into in depth, had a major crisis. It was, at the time, incredibly tuition-dependent place, and they did a bad job of forecasting the tuition. And so the result was, this all of a sudden was a huge hit, and they had about 30% less students come in one year than they thought, and so they had massive cutbacks. And then they did something that nobody ever does, and that is, they, rather than sort of saying, okay, we're going to take off 10% from everybody, they had a sort of a faculty leader congregation rate the various programs, colleges, and departments, and come to some consensus about who should take a hit and who should not. Now the weird part was, since it was at the time, I guess still by far the best rated place in the university and the best known, the Maxwell School actually got a raise. So we got more resources. The place that was hit the hardest, to my great advantage, was the College of Engineering. College of Engineering had a 30% cut. We had about a 5% increase. And so, guess what? It was easy to partner with engineers. You know, we would go to them and say, can we work with you? And they'd say, oh yeah, please, which is not often common, because they were happy to have some cut of the resources. And in turn, what we got was an entire floor of the engineering building. I was also appointed an engineering professor. You probably didn't know I was an engineer, most people don't. And taught in their program, course on technology assessment. We shared some of their students, so my program then became about 1/3 engineering students, which kind of allowed us to do a lot more than in the center's portfolio than we would otherwise been able to do. So the short story is, institutional decline can be your friend if you're in the right place. The other thing that was a major development, and this has happened to me very rarely in my entire career, is we developed what I refer to as a sincere client for our work. A sincere client, there's basically three types of people who will give you money to do policy-related research. The most common type of person is somebody who is doing their bureaucratic fiduciary duty, has to get the money out the door, has to juggle the peer review, and they give you the grant or they don't. And there's not much more to it than that, and of course I love that too, just like you do. On the other hand, if you're doing more practical things, particularly politically relevant things, The other type of client is the insincere client, which is the client who already knows the answer and wants you to prove the answer that he or she already knows. And I've had some very nice grants for that. For example, one time the DOE gave me a contract to do some research on what they were then experiencing having to do with the competitive bidding for national laboratory contracts. They already knew my position. They knew I had some data. They hired me because they knew what I was going to come up with. That's an insincere client. They didn't want to know the answer. They thought they already knew the answer. In this case, thought I did too. But every once in a while, you come across a sincere client, and this is what happened here. It was New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, which is the second largest energy provider of research in the nation. And the president was somebody I'd known for a long time, and he said, look, I know you, I trust you. I want to know what works here and what doesn't. And he really meant it. And so we spent 2 years. We got an apartment in Albany. They gave us office space. We had about 15 people deployed on the project. And it's such a valuable, wonderful experience, and one that the odds are that you'll never have. But basically, they really wanted to know the answer to what we were doing, and they gave us the resources. And that was a wonderful project also because we got lots of dissertations out of it. We got one book, we got a lot of articles, but the most important part was we learned so much about that organization that it was amazing. And I'm not going to go into this now because it's really off topic, but much of the book that I subsequently wrote on red tape and bureaucratic pathology emerged from that work, even though you'd never see the connection if you read the book. But I just learned so much about this incredibly large, incredibly complex organization that it was like a magnificent laboratory of the sort that one almost never has. The other thing I found that was not so good was the difficulty of managing green-eyed monsters. So as you might imagine, with this kind of experience that I just recounted, people who are even normally of goodwill will look and see, I'm really, really smart. I'm certainly smarter than this guy. And he has 20 people working for him and a big budget, and I'm scraping by to get an RA to help me or a TA, and I don't like it. Well, replicate that all around a program in a building, and then it actually becomes an interesting political problem because you either have the ability of accommodating people or you have the ability to somehow win them over, but otherwise, if you are able to succeed, people, I'm really sorry to say this, often get out their knives for no other reason just because you succeeded. And they assume naturally that you're taking resources from them, even if you're not, even if everything is external. They assume that if this guy succeeds less, I will succeed more. So why is that a special problem? Easy. If you're in the physical sciences or the life sciences, the question about resources is who has more. If you're in the social sciences, most people don't have hardly any. Now, I realize that a lot of the researchers in this room happen to work in the same areas that I do, which is always relatively abundant resources. But what if you really do is game theoretical estimations of vote trading and constitutional conventions? That's hard. Somebody talked to me once about getting a grant for that. I said, okay. So but that's a very hard thing to do, and you've got to be a smart person, but you're not going to have any resources to do that. So a lot of the people that I'm around all the time are people who do things like that are worthwhile, interesting, maybe more interesting than what I'm doing, but the world does not give them any money. So that's one of the things that's very different about being in the social sciences. And most of the part, usually when you're in engineering, everybody's kind of living in the same world. They have the same Weltanschauung. They have the same notion that people need resources, they go get them, they're funded. It's not the same thing in the social sciences or the humanities. The other thing I found out from this program, which made it the largest program I ever ran, was the limits of span of control. At one point, and this is actually an embarrassment, I had 16 dissertation advisees. Now, I did farm out a lot of them. I convinced them to work with other people. Typically, if you're the person who is the PI and they're going over your project, students, this is a good lesson for you students. You think that your supervisor will feel betrayed if you work with somebody else. No, we don't. So we wish you well. You don't have to work with us. It's okay. But yeah, learned about that one. You learned about the limits of the span of control. Here's a sort of a couple of minor lessons. Well, one's minor, one's major. One of my fun things was I became a CRADA. Have you ever been a CRADA? Probably not. I've been a CRADA. So what a CRADA is, it's a Cooperative Research and Development Act, which it's legislation that came out in the 1980s that allow laboratories, usually federal laboratories, to partner with usually business. And for a while there was a big push in the Department of Energy and the Defense Department to assign as many CRADAs as you can because it would show that you were really active in working with business and other communities outside the lab. And so I became a CRADA because we did an assessment of the photonics laboratory at Rome Air Force Base, and it was a student workshop. So there it was, my student workshop, which involved 3 people, and the transfer of $5,000 was there in their appendix that year, a list of CRADAs that we worked through, which they took to Congress to try to get more money. I've been a CRADA. It was very fascinating. The other thing I learned about, which I'm sure most of you already know about, is the wire. And I'm not talking about drug dealing in Baltimore, I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about the difficulties of trying to get money for something you think you have great capacity for, when in fact you don't know anything about the people who are giving you money. So we tried to get some money from the Naval Sea Systems Command for the very simple reason that I won't get into the reasons, but because of the people we had working with us and their backgrounds, and because of the exact nature of the content they wanted, we felt that we were demonstrably more qualified to do the work than anyone else. And went down to meet with the people, and the first thing they asked us, well, you haven't been to our program meetings? No. We've never seen you before? No. And then the guy just started laughing hilariously, and we knew that probably it was time to get back on the plane at that point. But before he got out the door, he says, well, let me just tell you, I don't know what your background is, and I don't care, but you're not going to get any of our money if we don't know you. Now, there's lots of ways to look at that. One way is you have to engender trust with people before they will give you money, at least people other than the National Science Foundation. They don't have to necessarily know who you are, But the other way to look at it is, isn't it strange that not only do you have to get to know them, but it's the same people getting the contract the same year for almost everything? That's a fascinating bureaucratic topic. As I said, the other thing I study is bureaucracy, and you can make a very good rationalization for it related to the cost of learning curves, transactional cost of doing business with new people. Or you could study the other part of the work that I do, which is corruption, and you can put it in that category. It's up to you. Go either way. All right, so this will be of interest to some of you. Another program that I worked with very closely was the Center for Science Policy and Outcomes, CSPO, later the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes, and most of my activity was when it was at Columbia. Now, legend would have it, and legend to some extent is true if it's very carefully considered, that this organization was founded by Mike Crow, Barry Bozeman, and Dan Starowitz. It's actually not true. The more accurate accounting is that Mike Crow founded this organization, and he immediately contacted Barry Bozeman and Dan Starowitz about helping him get it off the ground and design it and work with it. And so we did. So I'm not going to talk about this right now. I'd rather leave this to the Q&A because you probably have questions I couldn't even anticipate. But one question that's interesting to me is for those of you who are CSPO relatives or progeny, I guess is probably a better way to look at it. And so for those of you who are, then you might wonder, is this really your genetic material? And what is your genetic material? And at what point was it, if any, was it mutated, and why? And so I'll be happy to talk about that. But the other thing is that it's probably not a good idea for me to go too far with this because my own activity has kind of waxed and waned, and so there's certain parts I can talk about in great detail, and then other parts I can't really say very much about. But at any rate, I'll be happy to talk about that in the Q&A session. So I think I left something out here. Yes. So the other program that I devised and learned very different lessons from. Remember, now I've already run this program at Syracuse, which I kind of honestly grew a little bit faster than I wanted it to. So I learned that lesson, and then I moved to Georgia Tech and ran something called the Research Value Mapping Program. While I started, in a sense at least, I was the first director of the school, and I guess in a way I really did start the school because I did hire new people, and I also presided over the introduction of 2 of the 3 major programs they have there. They had a master's program, and my job was to get the doctoral program up and the undergraduate program up. And so I guess I was kind of the originator in some ways of that school, while at the same time being the originator of this program. So this is something I'm going to tell you, and any administrators in the room will shrink from this and probably vilify me later. It's okay. I don't care. I'm looking around. I see some administrators. I can take your vilification. But this is my proposition. Academic administrators at this is misspelled, mid-level, the harder they work, the more they fail. And this is what I learned at Georgia Tech, which is everybody I knew was working too hard. So if you're a mid-level administrator and you work at that 80 hours a week, what happens? And I'm perfectly serious about this. What happens is you work 15 to 20 hours and you do really important things that are important to people's lives, student, faculty, and to make their lives better, potentially at least. And then the more you work after that, the more you're getting into their business. The more you're taking their time to start making them worry about stuff they don't want to worry about. And so when people ask me, how are you able to do your own research, start a center, and at the same time be a school director? The answer is simple. I didn't spend any time at all on stuff that wasn't important. And I had a very good instinct for what wasn't important, which was almost everything that didn't directly involve people in the course of their lives. Bang! That's my lesson for the day. That's the best one. So, the other thing that I learned here, which is kind of obvious, I won't dwell on it, was the values of having strong value alignment and being a destination research center. When I was at the Maxwell School, I was in a destination educational program. But not very many people came there to do science and technology policy. I mean, sometimes we transformed them. But a few people came. Micro came, British Anglo came. We got people to do that. But most people who came there, they came there because the Maxwell School was the best place they could go, they thought, for an education to work in the public service. And so, if they were in a PhD program, it was also the top-rated PhD program in that area. So what happened was I worked with a lot of people that were really smart, really capable, and they were what I refer to as hired guns. You know, we had money. We didn't have that many research assistantships. We hired them. They did the work. Sometimes they liked the work, but it's not the same as devoting your life course to a body of work. And so when I was at Georgia Tech, almost everybody there was either a science and technology policy, science studies, or a sometimes an environmental policy student. And so everybody that was working with me actually cared about the work. Only time that ever happened, and it was really fun. And I think it really helped us be a lot more productive. The other thing I found, this was very early on, was that just one faculty member and a postdoc can build a Potemkin village, particularly with a website. Because at Georgia Tech we started very small, because remember I had to recruit the students and build up the program. And so we never got as large as we were at Syracuse intentionally, probably about half the size. But that worked out very well. And the fact that we started small did not mean that we started with no visibility, because it's actually remarkable what a couple of people could do if they're really intensively focused on not only doing the work but disseminating it, which is how we got to be a verb. People got to know that we were doing this stuff in the research value mapping program about how to evaluate research programs, and some of the stuff was unusual to say the least. I mean, like for example, evaluating things on the basis of a scientific techno-human capital model. What is that? Or evaluating things on the basis of life course charting of CVs and transitions. What's that? And so people heard that we were doing some of these new things. Of course, we tried to make sure they heard. And then we had a couple of people come to us, including NIH, saying, we want you to do an RVM for us. And, you know, being pretty quick on our feet, we realized immediately that there was no such thing as an RVM, but we were going to do it for them anyway. And so we quickly structured it, and that's how we became a verb, by taking the tools we were using and evaluating a center at NIH, which, by the way, I won't get into this, but I'll do the question and answer, was the worst, by far the worst research experience I'd ever had. If you want to know more, just ask me later. So, the other thing I found, this is kind of an interesting lesson, is that you can be so successful in some contexts that your university president wants you just to go away. Now, this is a very interesting lesson, and one of the reasons I decided to leave Georgia Tech, not the only reason, I really like Georgia Tech in most ways, and even like this president. He was a very good president. But our program was doing so well that we were becoming nationally visible, and everything kind of came to a head in the state. At the time I was working on evaluating state technology-based economic development programs, and I gave a couple of talks about this in a variety of states and 2 other programs. And one of those talks, the head of the Georgia Research Alliance happened to be there. The Georgia Research Alliance was the kind of the cash cow for many of the university systems. It was kind of a way to funnel more money in the universities without using traditional appropriations. And so they asked me to do an evaluation and program plan for them and to sort of strategic design for them. I said, okay, I've done this in 3 or 4 other states, sure. Get a call from the president's office. The president says, Barry, you've gone too far now. This is an engineering college. All of our Georgia Research Alliance professors or engineers or scientists, we like it that way. You're not going to do this. What's the moral of that story? It's great to be a tenured professor. You can read the evaluation if you like. And you can also read the part of the evaluation that talks about some of the difficulties in the Georgia Research Alliance. It's published in Issues in Science and Technology, and about how we need to have an economic development agenda that basically does not, spends maybe a little bit of time worrying about what inequality means and about maldistribution of benefits. The president hated that. But then he left and he took a much better job, so these things happen. And everyone thrived. But the other thing that I found out, this is another nice lesson, one I hope you have this problem sometime, is you can do really well. See, most of us think about the National Science Foundation and the NIH, where having a patron doesn't count for that much. You know, you might have a patron, they're program rotator at NSF, and bang, they're gone. Okay, maybe they love you, but then they're gone. Department of Energy is not that way. So we had money. We were actually the only social sciences program for 8 years that had money from Basic Energy Sciences Directorate of the Department of Energy to basically devise new ways of doing research evaluation. They're the ones that basically made us into a research value mapping program by giving us some money to explore some of the approaches in the context of DOE operations. And then my farmer died. You probably heard the old joke. 2 guys are sitting around the bar, they're agricultural agents. One of them's crying, the other one says, what's wrong with you? And says, my farmer died. Well, this was kind of the reverse. My only patron died. He got Lyme disease at an early age. And guess what? No more money. That's the way these things work. And but it does at least show the power of having a patron who actually believes in your work, thinks you're doing a good thing, and you just need to have them stay out of the forest and avoid all the ticks and everything, and then things will work out just fine. All right, so that's the one I just said I would talk about. Now, this is also an instructive brief lesson. So I moved ultimately for lots of reasons, but I'm going to not make it very complicated because there's really mainly one reason that some of you probably won't like, but just being honest. I worked at Georgia Tech for many years. I love Georgia Tech, still do, but most of our students were going into the private sector And a lot of them were incredibly right-wing people who wanted to make a lot of money. Now you might wonder why people like that will go in a public policy program, and after this talk I'll explain to you in great detail, and the basic reason is we did things with them and for them that would help them make a lot of money. But the whole idea of having any kind of public service commitment at all, or even working in the public service, really only a small minority of our students ever did that. And I thought, you know, that's something that's really important to me, always has been. It's one of the things I loved about the Maxwell School. Almost everybody that graduated from there, even if they went into the private sector, they were doing public service work. And finally, I just thought, you know, I'd like to do something more with public administration faculty members, of which we had almost none at Georgia Tech. So I went from Georgia Tech, which was probably one of the best science policy programs in the world, to Georgia, which does absolutely no science policy, except for me when I was there. And they are probably one of the best public administration programs in the world. At least they're very high ranked and still are. And it's the only program in Georgia that really is. But it was really good, and everybody was focused on public administration research, which is why I decided to have that be the only place that I ever was where I did not develop a center. Much center-focused research. I did continue the research I was doing on the same topics, but it was not a fertile place to develop a center, which is something you need to think about, particularly in the social sciences. In the physical sciences and engineering, almost everyone understands research centers. And the physical sciences, or the social sciences, you cannot assume that. To these people, none of whom had ever had a grant. That's literally true. When I went there, we had 18 sterling faculty members. If you even close to the field, you would have heard the names. 3 of them had endowed chairs. It was something the university had really invested in, and none of them ever had a grant. So, and the students, they didn't know anything more about grants than they knew about the dark side of the moon or about science policy. So, you know, that's why I went there and did not do any of that work except my own work, which I continued to do, mainly with people at other places. I just kind of hunkered down and enjoyed being a public administration professor for a while, and it was fun. I really did enjoy it, and I had great colleagues and great students, some of which we hired here. They're really good people, but it was not the same environment at all, because they thought that what a grant was going down to the state legislature and maybe getting a little rider of some legislation so that you could go in and study whether trailer zoning was appropriate or not. And they had something there called the Vincent Institute, which is very good at what they do, that had a lot of applied researchers to work for the state on things like that and other things that are more interesting. And they set that up so they wouldn't have to do contract research. So having somebody in who had been very much involved in that, to them, wasn't much difference between that kind of work and a conventional research grant. So who wants to spend that time educating that many people or winning that many people over? Not me. So did not bother. That was the dog that did not bark at night, which of course was first featured in the Sherlock Holmes story, The Adventure of the Silver Blaze, as all of you probably. Now, that brings us to the future, and the present. Actually, I guess it's more of the present, which is the Center for Organization Research and Design at ASU. For lots of reasons, my wife and I, Monica Gahn, who's a professor here, decided to leave Georgia. To be perfectly blunt, she won't mind me saying this. Most of the reasons were very good reasons, and they were hers. But, you know, we moved several other times for good reasons that were mine. And like I said, I had a great department there. So we looked around, and finally, after considering 3 places, we ended up here. And so I haven't had a chance to learn quite as much here, but I'll go over some of the things that are a little different here than where I was before. So the first point, which could seem sensitive but will not be, is whether Martin Landau was right. And no, I don't mean that Martin Landau, not the one who was on Space 1999 and Mission Impossible and married to Barbara Bain. This is a different Martin Landau. He was a professor of public administration and organization theorist at Berkeley, who wrote a similar article talking about the values of redundancy and overlap. And it was a good article. Boy, we got redundancy and overlap here. If you want to do science policy and science studies, I know 4 places you can hang out here. And to some extent, they communicate with one another, which, witness, I'm here, right? That's pretty good. there's still much that remains to be worked out. I'll give you a great example, and I won't give you all the history of this. I have a colleague who directs a center at in my department, and he's a good friend of mine. And because of happenstance, he has a center that's almost like mine in its functions, and we're in the same department. We get along well. I don't know. Somehow that just doesn't resonate. I don't know. I'm not quite sure what's wrong with that, but it's all a function of sort of bureaucratic machinations and the ability to get resources. I understand that. But yeah, if we ever manage to pull things off, we're going to have a super mega powerhouse rather than 4 powerhouses. So I don't know. I'm not willing to invest energy in that, but I hope somebody here is. Another thing I found is whether there is in fact limits to bootlegging. So what do I mean by bootlegging? Well, of course, I should be an expert in that because I have a summer camp in Gumlog, Georgia, which is also has the name of Gumlog Town of Spirits and Distillation, which was actually the major bootlegging capital of the entirety of Georgia. But that's an aside. So what I mean by bootlegging is the process of getting grants that are large grants from normal places like Department of Energy, NSF, NIH, doing everything they want, maybe giving them even more than they want, and then taking some of that money and financing something completely unrelated. So almost everything I've ever done in public, okay, first of all, how many grants have I had? I don't know. How many grants have I had in public administration? One small one. People don't provide money in the United States for public administration research. It's just not done. I've got friends in Europe who routinely manage $1-million contracts to do public administration work. Here, we know the government is bad, so why do we want to do anything to finance something that might improve it, right? So basically the way I've managed to accomplish almost all of my empirical public administration research is by studying the organization of things like R&D labs. That's called bootlegging. Well, now the center that I've devised of my own making entirely is going in a sufficiently number of different directions, some of which have a lot of money available to them potentially out of the world of money providers, some of which, half of it is public administration with no money available to money providers, that my and other people's bootlegging imaginations are beginning to break apart. You can only do so much, and then after a while you just have to think, well, we're not going to get money for this. But it's a nice problem to have. So related to that is the problem of whether comparatively advantaged can help the worthy comparatively disadvantaged. Of course, we do that at the university level by saying, okay, here's your overhead, we're going to give part of it to the history department. All in favor of that. But also we do that in a more interdisciplinary kind of way in programs that are multidisciplinary. Other lessons still being learned. Sometimes I learn lessons because people tell me the lessons, and I'm sure I can get plenty of that regularly from here. Okay, the last thing I thought I would close with, I'm not sure I have time to go over this, but this is actually true. When I meet with my graduate assistants at the beginning of the year, I go over, and this varies a little bit, not much every year, the principles of Bozemanian Research Center Management. And this is the part that has to do with human resources chapters. And so those of you who actually have had any role in running a center might be kind of interested in considering whether you think any of this makes sense. So I'll just go over some of them quickly. Remember the prime directive, the production function. I had a meeting years ago that was kind of an epiphany for me with my graduate students at Syracuse who are all studying management, who told me that they were pretty open with me. They thought this was a really badly managed place. And my answer was, okay, here's the publications we had, here's the grants, here's people who got dissertations, here's the people we employed. Now why is this badly managed? Well, you don't have regular meetings, right? People just come into work anytime they want to. Bingo. Okay, so prime directive. And I think one of the problems the center directors have is they try to do too many textbook-like things without thinking, what is it I'm trying to accomplish? Minimal management structure, sporadic communication. Why? If I communicate with everybody who has a small need to communicate with me, that could take up my entire workday, and I mean that quite literally. Matrix organization projects, pooling. I like to work with people who can work together because it allows us to use slack resources and devote them to more than one project. I also like to work with students who are flexible. Delegate everything possible. This is also known as the Bozemanian substitutability principle. So, and also don't just say it to myself. Basically, my strategy is I do what I have a comparative advantage in doing, and I try anytime I don't have a comparative advantage, I try to get somebody else to do it. But I also say that to my doctoral students. I say, look, I don't want you doing stuff that I can hire an undergraduate at minimum wage to do just as well. Tell me. We'll hire somebody, we'll delegate it, I can use you on a higher order work. Value alignment, that should be clear. Reward workers with work, that's not always clear to people. Sometimes people say, well, I'm working harder than so-and-so. I say, yes, that's why you get more work. And that's why you get a better job, that's why you get a better level of recommendation, and that's why you'll be employed next term. I say, oh, okay, I understand. Organized teams are good, self-organized better. I feel like my research operation is working well when people organize their own work. They don't rely on me for that. Seniority is important, and I always go along with seniority when it does not clash against merit or skill. At Georgia Tech one time, and this was very, very rare, I just happened to have a run of graduate students who weren't very hardworking, weren't that able, two of them really, and they weren't very ambitious. And at the same time, I had some of the best undergraduate work study students I've ever had. I assigned the former to the latter, and this is a remarkable part, really remarkable. Everybody was happy. Didn't expect that. If none of the balls fall down, then you're not juggling enough balls. Put more in the air. And then finally, have fun outside work. Have fun with work. If it's not fun, just get a different job. You should be doing something else. We shouldn't be reporting to work and not having fun. And by the way, fun does not mean easy. Principles of Bozemanian management. Words to live by. Well, for me. And I thought I should probably end with another piece of artwork, which is the equipment room in the Center for Organizational Research and Design. All right. Taking longer than I wanted, but happy to answer questions or any patient people who might care to ask. Yes?
Can you go back to your point about the research that you did for NIH on research value?
Yeah, okay. That was an incredibly awful experience. I wouldn't name names, but I can't remember the name of the center. I think it's something like NICHD, I think it was. And basically what happened was I was overloaded. They really wanted me to do some work for them. I agreed to it, even though we didn't need the money because they were very much interested in having us do what we wanted to do. And then I have never been so micromanaged in the history of the world. And remember, this is not a grant, it was a contract. And the other thing that happened, which was understandable and completely ridiculous and stupid, was we got in trouble for telling them their centers were doing a really good job promoting and placing women and hiring them. And they, when we wrote our report, they X'd out every bit of that. In fact, they micromanaged and deleted about half of our report, including lots of things that made them look very good. They were quite honest. And why? That's the question I often ask my students. Why in the hell would anybody want you to take out the part about where you're doing a good job with gender relations? And the answer is, our colleagues will think we're trying to make them look bad. It was stunning, but I've had experiences like that. But long story short, most of it was over control. Bureaucratic pathology 101, trying to control the uncontrollable, trying to worry about things that don't require any worry. And it just made the whole thing. And I was so happy to get out of that I still haven't taken any money for any reason from NIH since that time. Yes?
You've mentioned alignment of values several times, but to what extent do you make those values explicit?
Oh, I try to make them very explicit.
How do you do that?
I try to inventory students as soon as they come in about what they're trying to achieve, what their career goals are, what they would like to know. And I tell them, basically what I'm going to do is every time I can, I'm going to honor those, and there will be times when I can't. So sometimes I need grunt work done, not often, or sometimes I just need some things done fast. But whenever possible, I'm going to give you assignments that are going to help me, but they're going to help you at least as much. And so I just make it explicit right up front.
Okay, that makes sense, but allow me to rephrase it. How do you make your values explicit to your students or your organization?
It's not really that hard. They're pretty simple. I don't have really detailed values. So basically what I'm trying to do is do highly to satisfy intellectual curiosity. That's it. That's really it. And a lot of it has to do with just enhancing scientific, technical, human capital. So I mean quite sincerely that if I was going to pick the #1 function of any center I've ever run, it's making sure that we turn out people. First of all, we just support people, and then that we also turn them out, and they're better than they were when they came in terms of their capabilities. That's #1. Other questions, comments?
I like your emphasis on informality and its importance in these centers for creativity. How do you balance that as someone who thinks about bureaucracy with a tendency for vigor, for bureaucratization? How do you remain small while getting bigger? How do you get big while remaining small?
Yeah, that's actually a question that has fascinated me for my whole career. So one of the things that's been really fun for me is the fact that I studied bureaucracy and organization theory and research policy and administration. So putting those two together is something I do constantly. And so one of the things I try to do is actually look at issues from the standpoint of organization theory. I try to think about how to minimize transaction costs. I try to think about the rationalizing whatever structures and functions that I have within an organization. And I try to hammer efficiency home every time possible when it does not inhibit effectiveness. I try to have no rules that are unquestionable at all, which is a great advantage of running a center. It's not like if I worked in the IRS and I might have a good job, I might have a good boss, and there would be lots of things that I had to do a certain way and I would have no ability to do anything about. So for many years, basically, I've executed a number of kind of mini rules that I don't even have to think about anymore. One personal one, which I don't recommend to anybody, is if I go to any meeting, I'm there 10 minutes and I don't think anything's being accomplished, I leave. I say, I'm sorry, I've got someplace else to be, which is true, which is any place but there. And I also try to have very few meetings myself that I instigate. In my center, we never have more than one meeting a year. A term, and not always that. That's not focused on research groups. I encourage people to meet in small groups. A lot of that can be replicated no matter what the size of your organization. The whole reason, and we never have, ever have ceremonial meetings. That's very common almost everywhere. We don't have ceremonial meetings. I never tell anybody, well, you've got to show up to this research presentation because this person is a big kahuna and we'll be offended if nobody's there. Everybody who comes in for a presentation, and we have a lot of people that we like to have a fertile intellectual atmosphere. I tell them the same thing. We are not inviting anybody to your presentation who does not really work in the area and want to know about your specific topics, and don't be surprised. Kind of set the framework, and that way we don't get hammered down with a whole bunch of extraneous activity. I try to really respect the idea that people are doing important things, or they're doing them well, they want to do them well, they don't want to be distracted with a lot of things that might be very interesting if they had all the time and energy in the world. And so, this sounds kind of, I'm not sure arrogant is the right word, maybe stupid is the right word, but I try to think very seriously about the stuff in my own book about how to fight red tape. And I really do it. Because a good part of that book was basically based on cases of vexation that I encountered in the world. I have whole case studies. It's very therapeutic. I go someplace and somebody does something insanely stupid, it comes out of the next edition.
Thank you.
Let me just follow up, yes, but let me follow up on that. I just came out with this book on research collaboration, and one of the things I want to do more on, as you know, everything's getting larger in the size of collaborative teams. It's not uncommon to have teams of 20 or more, and boy, is it creating collaboration problems. And it's not even the ones that you would predict having to do with distance and time. It's more related to the fact that you have that many people together with that many different sets of value sets and references, all of which need to be taken into account, and it's almost impossible. So the conflict ratio is escalating all the time. Interesting problem nobody's really working on. Yes?
I'm just curious whether you think of research centers as tied to a specific leader, because there's also an issue of when a center is informal enough, it might depend a lot on the person or a couple people in charge. And then if they turn over, do you just give up and say we should have a new center, or is there some balance of bureaucracy and informality that would allow it to be sustainable longer than a particular leader?
Well, that's a really good question. It's a kind of a basic question in organization theory that goes well beyond centers. It's called the problem of executive succession. Lots of different theories about that. Trying to think if, actually, in my own experience, almost everything I did succeed me and had another leader, and I didn't have to even think about it. So, for example, when I left Syracuse University, there were two people I worked with very closely. I knew they could step right in and do what I did, and do it the same, well, maybe not the same way, but do it well. And so I haven't ever given a lot of reflection to that. But another reason is the stuff I'm talking about in the scheme of centers is really small potatoes. You know, so what we think of in social sciences as kind of a big center, they're not almost ever. And so it's not really a sort of a major institutional problem if the organization goes away entirely. But yeah, that is an issue, and lots of people try to groom leaders. They also, in some cases, try to make sure they have a turnover plan with sort of term limits. So there's lots of ways that's handled, and I know that because that's one of the things we asked when we went around and interviewed people in lots of different interdisciplinary centers, all in sciences and engineering, all around the country. They've got different ways of handling it, and the most common way is not handling it at all. And so a lot of the centers go away, and in some cases that's tragic. In almost every case, the resources are deployed to something else useful. So, yes.
Can you talk a bit more about your experiences relative to the interdisciplinary nature? You know, you talked sort of about being a public administration professor in an engineering college, in a public administration program. What about especially the potential differences in organizational culture, disciplinary perspectives, when you're trying to bring together multiple different disciplinary perspectives into a single center?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I should have addressed it more. But the truth of the matter is, I've never worked in any context except when I was at the University of Georgia, and even somewhat there, that wasn't incredibly interdisciplinary. And so it's just kind of second nature to me. But it really becomes a problem if you're trying to get outside the social sciences and unite with other people who are not the social sciences. And I do have some ideas about that. So what I found is that trying to win over, quote, engineering or biology is a fool's mission. Hey! I'm not done. I'm not done. Well, maybe I'll stop there. But but what I've always tried to do is not try to convince an entire unit that they really need to work with us, but to find one or two people who had some reasons to be interested in what we're doing or thought that they could benefit from it. And not only just to kind of, I never really tried to argue with anybody in biology or engineering. They should work with us because of goodwill. I'm trying to always find out how it is that we can help them and help us, and how can we convince them that we can do something they would find valuable. But it's never a whole unit, and I'm not sure that would ever work. But finding a couple of like-minded people is amazing what you can do. Like, for example, I talked in the Syracuse case about this guy. One guy, Walter Meyer, was the only person in that whole college who really focused very much more broadly than his own work. And the other people there did great work, but you know, they really were interested in how to solve some sort of algorithm in CAD/CAM, and they didn't want to know anything else. But we did find him, and then he brought in a couple more people. Bang, that was all we needed. Wouldn't have even been particularly helpful to do more than that. Might have been harmful. So that's the big thing, is making sure that you can find people who are like-minded, who have adjacent kind of interests. And sometimes you can't, but then you just don't try to force fit it.
I've been asking myself a question that I can't answer. It sounds so basic and naive. I want to ask you, at the risk of humiliating myself, what are centers for? Like, what do they do that people who just want to work together can't do without the letterhead in the center?
Okay, that's certainly a very reasonable question, and I've had a lot of experience with that because that's what I did at the University of Georgia. I did a lot of the same work, didn't change my trajectory very much, and it was not in the center. So this is what these are some of the things that people can get out of the center that they don't do in that model. First of all, there's kinds of spillover effects and agglomeration effects of working together, so you become known as, you know, a verb, like doing research value mapping or whatever. that you can't do very easily just as a small group. Secondly, usually a center, not always, will have more institutional staying power, so that if somebody leaves, things don't necessarily crumble immediately. So that's an advantage. Another advantage is purely political. You know, if I go to the dean and I say, look, Joe Bob and I and 2 other people, we're kind of interested in so-and-so, are we getting support for this? That might work, but on the other hand, if I go in and say, we have this idea for a center, and here's the structure of it, here's who we want involved, here's the way we're going to run it, here's the way we're going to divvy up the money and give them some more details, and here's also something you can claim on your own agenda, then that's more likely to be successful. You know, they may say something, well, we've already got too many centers. But it is arguable that there's some value added that way.
It sounds a little bit like the Potemkin village that you alluded to.
And villages sometimes work. Right? I mean, ask Potemkin, he knows. Right? But actually, I'm being flip because it's not only that. If you get some economies of scale beyond having 3 people work together, it's easier to do things like have resources for visiting scholars, which we have all the time, speaker series, which we have all the time. You can more easily attract students and saying we've got a bunch of guys working together here. So it does have some institutional value.
Well, sadly, we do have to let people go, but I encourage you to stay and bombard Barry with more questions close up. I want to ask him more about